So here we are for part two, building these solar panel racks from scratch.
Check out part one if you want to see the beginning of it.
You might be wondering why I've made these into little separate groups of three instead of making one big long bleacher kind of a assembly. Well, the main reason is that my terrain is slanting downhill as I go from each group to the next group. So it would have made the one big bleacher idea not be very practical unless it was staggered down the hill. Otherwise, the last downhill pole in the bleacher rack would be very tall, way too tall.
Oh my.
And this tilting feature, of course, is easy like this because I've already loosened up the bolts on each pole. These solar panels have 72 cells each, where many are only 60. So 3 of them comes out to a voltage that's getting close to the max of my charge controllers. So 3 it is. Every place is going to have a different kind of rock or dirt or sand, hard, soft, who knows. Also, the local building code requirements are going to be different in different places. How deep to make the hole, how wide, etc. Now, power augers could save some time, but when this one hits some root or rocks, boy, look out. My place, I had clay that softened up with a little water soaking. And then I ran into some dark gray shale rock down about 2 feet. I found that if I broke it up and fractured it, I'd get a few more inches out each time. And then there's this other kind of bar, I don't know what they call it, but it's big and heavy and it's got a flat blade on the end. That helps to break them up even more. Then I scoop that out and I get a few more inches each time till I finally get down deep enough.
I wanted to point out the downhill nature of the lay of the land here.
Even between these 2 poles, I've got to make the one on the right about 5 inches longer than the one on the left, so they'll come out level. So then I want to install the unistrut beam into the pipe. And this is all just hardware store grade 2, these nuts and bolts. But going up higher to grade 5 or 8 even wouldn't cost that much more and it would just be that much stronger. It's up to the builder. Okay, time for mixing some mud and filling up the holes. This stuff is kind of like a shredded up rope. They throw a bag of it into every yard of mix and it acts like a binder, keeps the concrete from cracking as easy. So I pinch out about this much per 60-pound bag and throw it in the mixer. I'm kind of getting older and wimpy, so I'm cutting these down in half so there's only 30 pounds lift into the barrel to mix.
Avoid breathing that powder.
This has to be done after each bag to get all the air bubbles out.
And I want to start getting these closer to level. It should be done several times as the hole fills up.
Well, I eventually get both holes pretty full, so I want to start measuring these poles against each other to get them the right distance apart and to get them square. And there's one other measurement that's not so obvious to do but is important, in that if these poles end up by chance at a certain distance apart, the unistrut crossbeam holes won't match up with these holes and they can't be bolted together. So if my holes won't match up on these cross beams, I've got to move the poles slightly, either in or out, just one or both, even if it's off level a little tiny bit, to get the holes on the cross beams to match up so that this can be bolted together without needing to drill any holes. And of course, it's important to do all this while the concrete is still soft. That black circle form is just some 30-pound roofing paper held together with some Gorilla Tape, duct tape.
This is a reenactment. I already did it yesterday, just showing how it goes.
Later on in the first day of the pour, take off the tar paper and round off the corner edges of this, just to make them so they're not sharp. Instructions on the concrete mix say to keep this concrete wet for 3 days after you do the pour. So I just rip up the bags and wet them and put them on. It's going to need to be kept wet like 3 or 4 times through a sunny afternoon, or some people put plastic bags over it so it won't dry out so fast.
So 3 days stay wet, and the full strength is reached in about 5 days. Some solar panels will have several different choices of holes on it. Like you can see here, there's 2 that are in that I'm going to use, and then there's some further out towards the end. We've already seen a view of this in part 1. This is from underneath, and isn't that sweet to have the solar panels have their holes match up with the unistrut holes? That's 4 holes per panel that don't need to be drilled. 12 holes per rack for 3 panels, and I'm doing 7 racks, so you can multiply that out. We're talking 84 holes that don't need to be drilled. Oh yeah.
Now let's talk a little bit about the hardware we're going to use to bolt these together. This group is all stainless steel parts. We've got the very first normal flat washer there. Then we've got this external tooth washer. We'll talk more about that later. Then this bigger fender flat washer, then a split lock washer, and then a hex nut. So how this all works in the mounting is that the small washer and the external tooth washer go up on the inside, while the big fender washer, the split lock, and the nut are on the outside, like here. There's lots of room for adjustment and getting the panels all squared away with the right spacing. Now about this external tooth washer, in some jurisdictions the electrical code says it's okay to use these to ground the solar panel aluminum frame to the body of the rack, and these little edges bite into the anodized aluminum and make a good electrical connection for the ground circuit. And again, see, it would be up on the inside right there, biting down onto the panel's aluminum frame. But be careful, they only go in one way. Only one side bites in. The other side is more smooth.
At least it's that way on this brand.
There are other ways to ground the solar panels to the rack, and we'll show one of those later on. Meanwhile, let's move on ahead and tighten up all these bolts. And I want to be sure to activate the clutch at a pretty low torque value. I have to be careful not to over tighten them. So this is where the tilt adjust beam is going to go, and this is the size it looks like compared to the other main beams. First thing I want to do is drill 1/2-inch hole through the pipe, and I've just decided on coming down this distance. Now for this part, I need to temporarily clamp this beam up here on this other beam to see where it comes out in relation to the pole. See how far away is it from coming up and skimming alongside the pole. I'm going to have to add shims up here to bump this beam out so it'll move right past this pole, like that. And it seems to be different on every rack I've built, even on which side of this I clamp it. So I'm going to clamp it on the other side and see one side will need less shims than the other, and this side looks like it would need more, so I'm going back to this side. I want to use as few shim washers as possible. I'm going to work my way up through the drill bit sizes till I get to 1/2 inch, and I only am drilling through one side. You might remember this from part 1. It's just a little stone that gets rid of the burrs on the inside of the hole. And I'm going to make a spacer out of this 5/8 hex nut, shaving down both sides to fit. We'll see up ahead. And I'll need a couple of flat washers to complete the spacer. So the idea is to put the spacer down in the beam here, and here's a fender washer to straddle across the whole piece. That's how it's going to go on. If no spacer is used and I tighten this down, it's going to squeeze and deform and bend the unistrut beam. Then coming on down to this other end, I'm going to try another kind of spacer. This is just a chunk of 1/2 inch plumbing pipe. Does the same job as the first spacer, but it's much simpler because it's only one piece. But it serves the same important purpose. Without the spacer, when this was tightened down, it would just bend and deform that beam. So when it comes time to adjust the rack, I just take the nut off, push this back in like that, and then I can easily change the tilt angle of the rack. Then when I'm satisfied, I can push it back through, put the washers and the nut back on, and tighten it up. There is one weakness of this design, and that's if someone tries to tilt this pushing on one side, it'll twist the whole thing and it could break the glass in the solar panels, so that's a no-no. It should only be adjusted in the middle like this, and being very careful that you're pushing evenly. And it helps to have both of these bolts about the same tightness. This is the other grounding method I mentioned, and it's pretty common, and all the panels are bonded together through this solid copper wire and the use of these grounding lugs. And you'll see they're relying on the same method of the tooth washer biting into the aluminum frame to get the true electrical contact. For more details about this grounding and just the general electrical wiring, there's a lot of good information out there, YouTube videos, etc. It's high voltage DC, no joke. I'm getting and using bolts for this that don't have any threads until the very end, so that all the load-bearing part of the bolt doesn't have threads. And I want the bolt long enough so that it comes all the way out before the threads start. And it won't be a problem tightening this down, because if I put a few washers on there, the nut will always have some threads to grab.
So briefly, I'm just going to show here how I made up these spacers. This is the 1/2 inch plumbing pipe version. I'm deburring the inside and outside so they're smooth. Then I'm going to measure it and cut it off. The cutting makes this very hot, so I'm just going to let it drop into a little cool cup of water. Then I'm going to deburr this side that I just cut, get rid of all the rough, sharp edges. Now I'm going to do the other version of the spacer. This was the 5/8 hex nut with 2 washers.
I'm going to shave the sides down so it'll fit. 2 opposite sides. So you can see now it'll slide down in there. The problem with this way is that you have to find two washers that are the exact right thickness, and sometimes that isn't so easy. So maybe the 1/2-inch plumbing pipe spacer is the best way to go. But either way, all the places that are bare steel now have to be painted with something so that they won't rust. Same with these holes I drilled. Bare steel needs protection from rust. Now some people might be wondering about galvanic corrosion, where I have different metals touching each other. In 30 years, I've never seen it happen. Maybe it's because I live in a climate that's not very humid and I don't live by a salty coast. So, it's not an issue for me.
Suit yourself.
Say I've got this great business opportunity if you want to get in on the ground floor. It's called a solar clothes dryer.
No.